this little presentation on how the West was lost. Yeah, let's big round of applause for that title. So we're planning on doing this 3 weeks. We think it'll take 6 hours. We don't really know. Yeah, I don't know how long. I haven't done this before. I haven't even actually done a dry run, so I have no idea. Let's hope we can get it done in 6 hours. It's 2,500 years of history, 6 hours, do the math. It's a fairly big compression ratio, so we're gonna have to do our best. 30! Now there's something to cheer about. All right, so the question that was asked to me is kind of like, okay, well, why are you doing this? What is this about? A lot of good questions. I'm not sure that I have the best answer for it, but come on. There we go. But one thing I alluded to sort of when I was doing the intro was something about, okay, what's going on with society, what's going on with our present Western civilization, our culture, and those sorts of things. I talked a little bit about all the goings on over the last 5 years, but what actually originally got me started on this was this kind of, call it social catchphrases that we kind of, in our Western society, we've seen. And so just take a look at these phrases. Can you all read them? Hopefully you can kind of read them. You can kind of get a sense of what they are. You've probably heard of some of them before. You've probably heard of many of them before. Hopefully you have. And then take a look at some of these ones. Yeah, well, if they look the same, then you need glasses, better glasses. Oh, whoops. Okay, if they look the same, I need a better clicker. Good point, very good point. Sorry. Okay, do they look the same now? Hopefully they don't look exactly the same. And the reason is because they are different. I have advanced the slide. And you may feel like, yeah, you know what, these ones I've seen a lot of too. I understand that they're very much in vogue in the media now. And the fact is, when I look at overall what we're doing, what has happened in recent times, in our Western civilization. When I say Western civilization, I'm talking primarily about, look, 31. I'm talking primarily about Europe and North America. And, you know, these are, you could call them the cradle of modern civilization. They're certainly, in some senses, people would call us the most advanced civilization. But what's happened over the last 30 years? Well, we've seen our language has changed, obviously, in terms of our catchphrases, but also we've seen just basically values have changed significantly just in the last little while. Traditional values have been overturned. Historical and cultural figures previously that were either worshipped or venerated, many of them have been canceled now. We have terms like gender spectrum, defunding the police, education is oppression, you've probably heard of that. White guilt and white privilege, Western culture is genocide. A lot of popular figures previously, heroic figures, who have now been canceled. Yeah, Dr. Seuss even in that list. J.K. Rowling, Sir John A. Macdonald, Snoop Dogg, I just threw him up there. He was actually sort of canceled for performing at the Trump inauguration, this recent one. So, and he was, canceled. We also see that there is a very much, I guess you could say, a significance or an elevation of certain groups that would be considered marginalized. The LGBTQ, you can see all sorts of various holidays and various recognition for Black History Month, BLM, Orange Shirt Day, Red Dress Day, I think was just the other day. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Hashtag Me Too, hashtag Girl Power. These are just two hashtags that went very viral recently. So you see a lot of these sorts of things happening. Obviously, as well, with that goes a lot of, I guess you could call it dissension or conflict, polarization on a bunch of issues, women's sports, how to handle drug addiction, sexuality and gender, race relations, Indigenous rights, policing, education, vaccines even. I mean, the fact is we live in a society today that's extremely polarized, and it's a very good question, is this progress? Are we, as a Western civilization, the pinnacle of progress, or where are we? I said, is this the end? Spoiler alert, I don't think it's the end, but maybe it's close. Anyhow. In Calgary itself, we can see some examples very clearly, just right in our own parks. One of them, the one on the left here, General James Wolfe, who many people I don't think really know, but he was actually a British hero. He fought at the Plains of Abraham against General Montcalm, who was on the French side. In that battle at the Plains of Abraham, the British defeated the French, and basically that's what enabled us to become a British colony rather than a French colony. So that was a very significant war, a very significant battle. General Wolfe died actually on the battlefield, and he died a hero, and he was very much celebrated back in Britain. He was celebrated with many statues and many recognitions. This particular statue came from New York, the New York Stock Exchange, actually. And then they brought it to Calgary and placed it in South Mount Royal Park. And it still sits there. But not far from where we are right now, in Inglewood, you can see another statue, and it's called Wolfe and the Sparrows. It's right across from the Inglewood Drive-In, really, right near that bridge that goes across to the zoo. And it's the same statue, basically the same likeness, but instead of having his face posing heroically, it's basically completely covered now and completely obscured by sparrows, by nature and wildlife, and basically it's defacing his face. And the idea being that previous heroes are perhaps, in light of today, in light of time, no longer so much heroes. And so we see this kind of phenomenon happening quite often in our society today. This is the kind of thing that prompted this presentation, and that's why I wanted to do this. I think it's worthwhile to take a look at how we got to this place and why we got here. And then, so the first two sessions are going to cover that, hopefully. And then the last session, hopefully, we'll get to the place where we can talk about our Christian response to the society we live in. Yeah, like I say, it's all very hopeful. And that's because the person who is presenting this doesn't really know what he's doing. He's not a scholar or an expert. He doesn't really exactly know a lot about history, although I'm one of those people, I like it to make sense. I like it when it makes sense. And so that's why I do research. That's why I read up on things, because I wanted to kind of fit into a framework that makes sense. So that's why I did the presentation. That's why we're doing this. This is not a Bible study. I'm sorry. Although we will talk about the Bible probably in the third session a bit. This is going to be a lecture style, as you've seen already. I'm going to talk and you're going to listen, and I'm sorry. I know some of you are still in school, And some of you just got out of school, and you're probably getting PTSD already, just sitting there listening. And if you do feel a little bit triggered or bored, feel free to go get another drink if you like. But you have to come back, because we have to make sure we're over the 30 mark here. Oh, good. There you go. So you can't leave. That bottom question, is this presentation worth your time? Sorry, it's too late. You're here. The other thing, though, that I should mention about history, when you talk about history or when you write about history, the fact is that, you're going to pick and choose. In this case, I did a lot of cherry picking. There's going to be huge gaps in this narrative that we're going to present. I'm looking at philosophical trends. I'm not looking at world events. So that's why there'll be very many big gaps. And the way we're going to do this is I'm just going to focus mainly on a few people, key people in history, and I'll call them the most influential figures, at least I feel they are. And we'll talk about the influence that they had. And that's kind of how we'll go. It's also, so the presentation's deficient in many, many, many other ways, and you'll find out all about that as we go through it. Good luck. Here we go. So, now, do we have to go back 2,500 years to understand where we are today? And the answer there is probably not, but I'm going to go do it anyhow, because I just like to, and that's where we're going to start. 2,500 years ago, in what is presently Greece, there was ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece, the philosophy of the day, if you could call it that, was this idea that there were gods. And these gods resided on Mount Olympus, and there were 12 main ones. There were many, many other minor ones, as well as other spirits and sprites and various other entities, and they all lived and did their thing, and it was through them that they somehow ruled the world and influenced human history. It's all very well documented, mainly in the poems of people like Homer or Hesiod, and so stories like the Trojan War, stories about conquests of Athens and Sparta, and those sorts of things. It was, if you want to have a good time, go back and read some of these stories. They are very fantastical, and to be honest, they're a little bit weird. There's a lot of things like incest between gods and things like that. It's kind of messy. The gods at the time, they very much reflected human behavior at the time. So it was very interesting that the Greeks came up with this, but that was their mythology, their way of looking at the world. It's kind of random, and the reason it's random is because these random people are basically ruling us. So philosophy started, though, and that we have primarily to thank a person named Plato for that. He's called the father of Western philosophy to a large extent. I think that's true. His actual teacher, Socrates, is known as the founder. Socrates didn't actually do a lot of philosophizing himself. Socrates was the founder of this method whereby you ask questions of somebody. So, what do you think of Zeus? Is he all-powerful? Well, yes, of course he's all-powerful. Well, if he's all-powerful, how come he didn't destroy Hercules when Hercules accused him of being a whatever? Well, maybe he couldn't at the time. Maybe he's not all-powerful. Well, if he's not all-powerful, is he really Zeus? So that's what Socrates did. He asked these questions, and they got answers. And very quickly, it was clear that the Greek mythology that had built up over the centuries was not true. Socrates was actually sentenced to death for his, he was basically caused or charged with adulterating the Greek youth at the time, poisoning them with these bad ideas, and so he was sentenced to death, and he died. But his thoughts were very pervasive, and Plato, his student, carried on with those thoughts. And pretty much by the time Plato became a prominent teacher, it was very clear that Greek mythology was not the order of the day. In fact, there was something else that needed to take its place. And Plato himself, he prompted all of that with his profound questions about, existence, creation, the world. Where does this world come from? Where do humans come from? Why do we exist? He was especially really concerned with questions like, how come all of us humans have these same instincts? Like, they're not just random. We all know. It doesn't matter where we come from, what language we speak. We know what certain things are. We know what love is. We know what motherhood is. We all have that same warm feeling when we think about that. We know what goodness is. We know what evil is and meanness. How do we all know those sorts of things? Where do those things come from? So, Plato developed a theory, and it's called the theory of forms. And basically, his theory was, I think there's something more than what exists here in this real world. There's something called the world of ideals. And that world of ideals is a perfect world. That's where these concepts come from. All of these concepts are in the world of ideals. It's perfect, invisible, ideal world of ideals. And our physical world is just a reflection of that perfect world of ideals. We live in this imperfect world. We have to deal with this imperfect world. But the world of ideals, that perfect world is out there, and we should try and figure it out what it is. He had this allegory. He called it his cave, Plato's cave. You may have heard of that, some of you. Basically, his allegory is human beings, we all live in this cave. We're like prisoners that live in this cave. And we, in this cave, can not really see much of what reality is, but every now and then we can see that from bright light in the sunshine, we can see these shadows, and we can see these figures, and we can see these things moving around. His idea is, you know what? That is like what we're living in right now. And we can see shadows of what the real world is, the real ideal world. We can see shadows of what it is. We can't really see what it is. In his allegory, he talks about, if a prisoner somehow managed to escape from the cave, get out, and actually saw the real world, well, at first he'd be blinded because he couldn't really see because his eyes are not adapted to the light. But once he could actually see, he could see the real world in all its vibrancy and beauty. And then he would know. And then he would come back and tell the other fellow prisoners what he'd seen. And they'd say, you're crazy, and they'd probably kill him because you've gone like all cuckoo, so. And that was kind of his notion of what reality really is. There's an ideal world, and then there's a cave world. His idea was that our souls somehow are connected with this ideal world, and that's how we know that there's this ideal world. And that's how we have this knowledge of this ideal world. But he says it's a job of the philosopher like myself and other teachers to come along and to help people to bridge that gap to that ideal so that people can really see what the ideal is and be able to live like the ideal would like us to live. And Plato also said, somehow this ideal world came from somewhere. It must have been the creation of someone. I'm not sure what or who, but it must have been a perfect someone, a perfect being of some sort with infinite power and capability and knowledge. A real God, not like Zeus. So that was Plato. And I think you can understand a little bit about where this was going. Plato had followers in the century after him. He had the Epicureans primarily and the Stoics primarily, and there were others too, but these are the two main groups. The Epicureans were the ones who said, you know what, that's probably true. The way we connect with the ideal world, not really sure. The only thing we have is our senses, so let's live life through our senses. That's how we connect somehow. a union with the ideal. They didn't believe in an afterlife, so they said, okay, you know what we need to do is just live life today for the fullest in all its pleasure. And so the Epicureans were big partiers and did all sorts of other things. That was their mantra. But the other followers were the Stoics, and they were the ones who were probably the most popular amongst the educated Greek and Romans of the time. They were the ones who said, you know, what we do know there's an ideal world, not sure how to live in an ideal way, but we believe the best way is, and you get in touch with this ideal, with the divine, by being a good person, basically. Sober examination of your character, live a life of virtue and harmony, and just be that person of integrity. And that's what the Stoics felt. They also thought, you know, and there must be some other connection between the ideal world and the real world. And they called it a reason. They also called it a demiurge. And they said this bridge or this thing or what force or whatever it was must have been responsible for the creation of the universe, responsible for how the world currently works. It kind of underlies everything, this reason. And it's the bridge somehow between the ideal and the real world. And later in the 3rd century BC, they started calling this reason logos. And logos is the bridge between the ideal and the real world that we live in, that ideal world. So, now I think you can see where we're going. By the time Christianity came along, which is, the 1st century AD, the world was ripe. Greek thought was ripe for Christianity. And I say it as a perfect union. Well, it's a pretty good union. Not perfect, but pretty good. But this concept of Christianity, God's perfection versus man's imperfection and the world's imperfection, is very much aligned with Greek thought at the time, in particular Stoicism. So some examples. We can see some examples right in the Gospel of John, in other Gospels, but for instance, Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, Logos. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Logos was with God, was God. Jesus is the Logos, the bridge between the ideal and the real world, the bridge between the Creator and man. Paul, same thing. 1 Corinthians 13:12, now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Colossians 2:17, these are a shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. That language is very Platonic language, Plato's cave language. We now see dimly, we now see shadows. These are just a reflection, a poor representation of what is really there, the things to come. And that was very much a Stoic type of thought. In Acts 17, in this little picture here is supposed to depict Paul's sermon on the Areopagus. I don't think it quite looked like that, but he was up there and he was preaching to Stoics and Epicureans. And he was talking to them about this new philosophy, Christianity. And he talked quite at length. And they were very interested. You can almost see when you read Acts 17 how they could have come along with that conversation, that discussion that he was presenting. And this idea that, he says there, "For we are its offspring," is a quote from your Stoic philosophers. And it is. This idea that being humans, being part of the offspring of the one God. And so you can see how the Stoics would not. Now, of course, it all fell apart in that presentation when he started talking about the resurrection from the dead. The Stoics did not believe in an afterlife. But that was the only point. Once you get past that point of, Jesus was the Logos, Jesus is the one who rose from the dead. That little bridge, that little, I guess, point of unbelief, believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That is the one thing that separated Stoicism from Christianity. And you can see how that kind of thing was the alignment there made Greek thought at the time very much aligned with Christianity, and is a big reason how Christianity came to be so popular within the Greek world and spread within the Greek and Roman world fairly easily, just because of the synergy with Stoicism. Now there are people, so I personally, I'll just make an editorial comment here. I personally think that's a providential, a God given, a God influenced, I guess, over the course of history. His influence made it in the fullness of time. These things come together to basically allow Christianity to flourish. You could say Jesus was the culmination of the Jewish thought of the Old Testament. He was the culmination as well of Greek thought and Stoic thought. And it all kind of came together within that Jewish and Greek Hellenistic world. And so I personally think that it's God's providence that put that together. There are others who don't think that way. And one of them, fairly famous, his initials are the same initials as the New Testament. And maybe you know who he is. Sorry, his first two names initials are the same as the New Testament. I don't agree with his position. I'd say most scholars probably don't, but at the same time, it is a position. If you want to talk afterwards about it, you can. But the fact is, whether or not you believe it was a good thing or not, it happened. And it was very much influential in the spread of Christianity throughout the Greek and Roman world. So the person who kind of put it all down on paper and kind of put it down in a book, and several books actually, was Augustine. He was just a background about Augustine. He was born in North Africa. He's an African, actually. He had a wild youth. He was basically partying a lot. He spent a lot of time with women. He was a devout Manichaean, and the Manichaeans believed that there was basically a war going on in the world between good and evil. And he spent a lot of time on the evil side. He wanted to be on the good side, but he couldn't seem to overcome his instincts, and so he was spending a lot of time on the evil side. Eventually, though, he was brilliant, so he went to school and became a professor of rhetoric in Milan, and that's where he befriended the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, church father, and was so impressed with Ambrose and his life and his willingness to be kind to this young, wild, crazy guy who thought he had it all and was just an excellent speaker and could influence people, but really, in his personal life, he was having big issues. And one day, as he was walking, apparently, he heard a voice saying, "Pick up and read." He saw a Bible sitting basically on a table in front of him, picked up and read. He saw this verse, Romans 3:14, arm yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ, spend no more thought on nature and nature's appetites, and that's when he realized, this is the answer. This is the answer to all my struggles and my woes and why I can't overcome my evil. I need the Lord Jesus Christ to do that. He returned to North Africa. He became a bishop there and dedicated his life to preaching and to writing. He wrote 96 books. That's quite a few. Two of his biggest books, Confessions, his autobiography, and there's a quote there, and the other one, City of God. I have the book. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it. it's a very long book, and it's hard to read. And when you have bad eyes like me, I'm going to use my age as an excuse. I can't read it. It's just, the letters are too small. Maybe if you had pictures, it would have been better. But anyhow, but his book, and it was written right after the sack of Rome in 410. So by the time 410 came around AD, Rome itself was a Christian city. The Roman Empire was a Christian empire. Constantine, back in 313, 100 years earlier, had converted to Christianity, and he had basically made Christianity the state religion for the entire Roman Empire. So many people, Christians at the time, said, yes, this is it. This is the kingdom of God. This is it. We are finally here. We've arrived. And, good times are coming now. It turns out that good times were not coming. And after that, there were other emperors who came who were not Christians. There were emperors who came who were Christians and still couldn't hold it all together. The power of Rome was disintegrating, basically, due to a whole bunch of factors. And it culminated in 410 with Rome being sacked by the Vandals, I believe it was. Basically, and it was two tribes who came together, and they sacked Rome. Basically, they burnt it almost to the ground. And so Augustine wrote this book, and he said, and his book is to Christians at the time, he said, look, you might have thought that Rome was the city of God, that Rome was it, that our Roman Empire was the kingdom of God. No, you guys had it wrong, and this is what it is. And he basically lays out in that book this dualistic kind of motif where he said, you know what, there's a kingdom of God and there's a kingdom of man. We're in the kingdom of man. We're living there right now. There's a kingdom of God, but that's the ideal world. There's the perfection of God and the fallenness of creation. There's the sinlessness of Christ, the sinfulness of man. He draws these contrasts out. And he said, sin has permeated all of this creation that we live in. It's Christ's sacrifice that has redeemed it. And he goes through and develops the theology of Christ's sacrifice and his blood and how it atoned for us, atones for creation, and through that, we basically can now have access to and can further the real kingdom of God, which is not the kingdom of man or the cities or any of that. That theology basically has become the basis for all of Catholic and Protestant belief over the centuries. And that's why he's really considered the father of Christian theology mainly by the Catholics and Protestants in the West. The Eastern Orthodox faith has different church fathers that were also influencing their theology. But certainly for the West, it was Augustine. So, very influential figure, and basically he wrote this all down. Despite the fact that Rome fell then, Christianity continued, though, to spread. And it still spread, not only because most of the Roman Empire already were Christian. These new tribes that were coming in, invading from the north, they weren't Christian, but they were quite open to whatever. And in this particular case, they were primarily warlike tribes, like the Goths and the Visigoths, like the Vandals, like the Franks. Those people came in, the Normans, and they basically were very warlike, but they had this idea that, you know what, you sacrifice to a god before your battle, and that God helps you to win. And so you can see on the third bullet there, it talks about Germanic polytheism warrior culture. Basically, they said, if Odin failed, if you sacrificed to Odin and it failed, well, one could try it with Christ for once. And so some people did that. And sure enough, they won the battle. And because they had a lot of success in battle, sacrificing to Christ, they became very much of the belief that Christ was their warrior king, their ultimate warrior king that was leading them into battle, allowing them to do all of these invasions and overtaking of all these lands. And it resonated very strongly with them, that Christian narrative that Christ was the warrior king. As well, this idea that Christ, the warrior king, sacrificed himself for his people. That was something that resonated extremely strongly with them too, this idea of hero, this hero who sacrifices. So the idea here is now throughout all of Europe, basically, all of the barbarian tribes are Christianized. The monasteries and cathedrals that had been set up continued to grow and expand. And they became centers of learning and education. And the Roman Empire itself, even though that had disintegrated, the Roman Church still carried on. And there was learning and missions and centers for helping the poor, and all those sorts of things were helping because of the church in those areas. And then education. Education was a big new part of Charlemagne, who came in about 800 AD and tried to reunite all of the Western Roman Empire. And when he did, Charlemagne, meaning Charles the Great, he dedicated that Roman Empire to Christ and made it one of his tenets to make sure that every city had a place of learning. So he was an influential figure as well. Let's see, where am I going here? If you look at what Europe looked like at that time, you can see all these colors. These colors, they used to be the Roman Empire. They were fragmented by, about 600 to 700 AD. But they were all unified by Christian belief. And that's kind of the story of Christianity and its spread. And I wish that was the end of the story, but it's not. Yes, it was a very much Christianized place, and yet at the same time, it wasn't exactly. As in, there were still many bad things that occurred during these times. Christianity was widespread, but it did not mean peace. These were very, generally speaking, by our standards, warlike people. And they were used to resolving conflicts through war. And Pastor Dan talked about Arianism in his sermon this past Sunday. Arianism, there were lots of battles fought over Arianism. And this idea that many of the Christians originally were Arianists, who believed that Jesus Christ was not God. He was actually a created being rather than God. There was a lot of wars. And when you talk about religious wars, well, religious wars, right, within Christianity. There are many tribal invasions and conflicts. And of course, maybe the big one, the rise of Islam. And Islam was, I'm not going to go into all of the details of it, but it was founded later on, 6th century AD. But the fact is that it was a very much an evangelistic type of mission, type of religion. But it wasn't evangelism by spreading the good news or doing good works. It was evangelism primarily by the sword, if they needed to. And so they came along and they basically conquered nations and made them convert to the Muslim religion, to Islam. And that happened all over the Middle East and throughout North Africa and through Spain as well. And obviously it was of huge concern to the church and to the other countries at the time, call them the empires at the time. And so the response to that was something called the Crusades, and I think you've all heard of the Crusades, and so this was the pushback. We are going to go now, and we are going to go, and we are going to take back these places, these holy places like Jerusalem or some of the ancient churches in Ephesus or Antioch. We are going to go back and we're going to retake those things, and they're going to be ours. So the holy wars were commissioned by the Pope, and that's what happened. They would gather all these troops together from all over the place. We'd say, bless them, and you go on your holy war, and you go retake Jerusalem, or whatever it happened to be. And it cost a lot of money to do these things. They had to raise funds. A lot of times they raised it on the backs of people who attended church for this holy cause. And frankly, too, it's hard to get tens of thousands of troops from countries who already, are occupied with doing their own thing. So they had to pay people to come, and these people that they paid to come on these crusades often were not really nice people. They were just doing it for the money. And so they would get on the crusade, and they'd all get on a caravan or on ships, and they would go. And off they would go. It's fair to say that the first three crusades, sort of successful, as in they were able to retake Jerusalem, and they'd set up Jerusalem as a Christian city for a little while, and then they would leave, and then Jerusalem would get retaken by those. Oh, okay, well, let's do this again. So a second crusade, let's go and we'll get this thing right this time. And sure enough, you'd go in and take it, and then you'd leave. And then after a while, whoops. So, three mixed results. But it was the fourth crusade that was by far the worst crusade. It was horrible. And so that one was when it was actually Christian on Christian violence, really. What it was the Roman, the soldiers from Italy that were commissioned to go and take over Jerusalem. They were told they would get paid when they got to Constantinople, which was kind of halfway in between. And they got to Constantinople, and they didn't get paid. And these are all mercenary soldiers. I need my money. I need my food. I need my whatever. You're not paying me. Okay, we'll take it out on Constantinople. And that's what they did. And they basically wiped out Constantinople. They sacked Constantinople. And this is Christian soldiers. And they wiped it out. They took off all sorts of treasures and goods out of Constantinople, back to the Venice, where many of them came from, and that led to this permanent schism, separation between the Roman and Eastern churches. So there you go. And I'm glad that's not the end of the story either. But yeah, it was a permanent black mark on Christianity, and it's one of those hallmarks events in the Christian faith where people started to question, really, about Christianity. Is Christianity the answer? When we have these kinds of wars between Christians, huge ones that result in huge separations and permanent damage. Incidentally, I think it was 2004, when the Roman Catholic Church officially apologized for this sacking of Constantinople by their sponsored soldiers. I should point out, too, the Pope at the time ordered those soldiers do not attack Constantinople, but he had no power, and they did. Anyhow, he apologized. 800 years later, to the day, there was an apology made, and it was accepted. So I'd like to say it's all forgiven now, but no, 800 years, no. Anyhow. There we go. You can't really see it here very well. These are the Crusades, the first four Crusades. You can see that people came from the purple areas, and they tried to overtake areas in the orange and the yellow. They're color-coded, these things. You can see, too. First Crusade is the dark color. Second Crusade is the green color. Third Crusade is the red color. The The Fourth Crusade is kind of this yellow color, and you can see that's the one that didn't make it to Jerusalem, to take Jerusalem. It made it to Constantinople, and sure enough, it took over Constantinople, which was already a Christian city, and wiped it out and took all the goods back to Venice. Anyhow, so why am I telling you all of that? Because this is kind of more history. And the answer is, I do have a method, or kind of a theme there, because there was one maybe small good thing that came out of that. And that was Aristotle. So Aristotle was a contemporary of Plato. He lived at the same time. He was actually Plato's student. But Aristotle said, you know what, this idea that there's an ideal world and a real, that's really speculative. Not for me. I don't think that's how it is. I think we live in the real world. This real world where we live, we can study with our senses. That is our task. Study this real world, and then through that, we can get a real idea of reality and how it works. That is our task as philosophers. Let's apply logic and observation to the world we live in. And that will tell us more about truth and reality. Through Aristotle at the time, he founded a whole bunch of these, call it sciences, studying biology and zoology and basic physics, economics. So Aristotle's school started all of those things. The fact is, though, is that Aristotle and his writings and everything, they were lost for many, many years, like hundreds of years, until the sacking of Constantinople. And when these Roman soldiers sacked Constantinople, they grabbed everything they could, all the treasure, all the wealth, all the documents, everything from the museums. They grabbed them all and they just threw them on their ship and they took it back to Venice. When they got back to Venice, that's when people started going through, what is this? Wow, we have never seen that. This is Aristotle. And they translated all of his works from Greek into Latin, the language at the time. And that's when they rediscovered Aristotle. And he's the founder of science. This idea that we study the creation that we live in, the world that we live in, and through logic and observation, we can make some truthful claims about that reality. You can see there's a picture here, a painting. It's actually a painting of Plato and Aristotle. And you see Plato is over on the right-hand side. No, the left-hand side. Plato's on the left. He's the teacher. He's pointing up to the sky. Aristotle's on your right. He's got his hand like this. He's pointing down to the earth. And the idea that Plato was always talking about the ideal, that realm that we can't see up here. And Aristotle said, no, the answer is right here in this earth. And so, difference of opinion, difference of thought, but both have led to some extremely important developments. When those documents came back to Venice, one of the first people to try and get their hands on it and translate it into Latin was a fellow named St. Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, he was a Dominican priest in the Roman Catholic Church, but he was extremely interested in this idea about the world around us and what does that tell us about God. He developed something that we now call natural theology, this idea that observations about the real world give us insights into God. Because all of creation speaks of us, or speaks of God to us. And he was very much interested then in this idea of let's apply observation, let's apply logic to those things that we see around us, and that is going to allow us to become not only familiar with the world around us, but familiar with the God who created it too. And it was really Thomas Aquinas who then set up the foundation for all of science. His teachings, along with this rediscovery of Aristotle, led to basically what we could call the scientific revolution of the day. And as Thomas Aquinas would say, science is not in opposition to religion. In fact, science is the pursuit of truth, and it's an integral part of discovering God and his truth and understanding his nature. And so Thomas Aquinas, one of those very influential saints, one of those very influential people within Western philosophy. So I think we did pretty good here. Less than an hour. We covered well over 1,000 years. So, but this is kind of what the timeline looks like. Let me, hopefully you can see that. Let me start kind of at the top. But first of all, of course, Greek theology, Greek mythology, many gods, many realities, no real truth, just a whole bunch of stories. Plato comes along. Plato says, no, that's not how it is. There's one God. There's one ultimate supreme God. There are really two realities. One's an ideal one, one's a physical one. But the fact is that one God is the source of one truth. And then Paul and Augustine come along later, and they say, yes, that's absolutely right. There's one God. There's two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. But there's one God, two kingdoms, and one truth, which is the Logos. On the bottom stream, you can see Aristotelianism, Aristotle's thought, which is, no, there's one God, all right, although that God, not quite sure what that God is, but there's one God, there's one reality and one truth, and we should study this world to discover it. Aquinas took that, he kind of amalgamated that with the idea that there is both a seen and an unseen reality, and we can study this seen reality with our science. The unseen reality, that's a topic for biblical study and for theology. Ultimately, there is only one truth, though, and that's again Logos, and that basically became classical Christianity. This idea that we have one God. There's only one. There's one reality. It's seen, both the seen and unseen. Science and theology, though, are those two ways in which we study those two realities, and they're united in the pursuit of truth. And that's what classical Christianity kind of was all about. And that's maybe we'll take a 5-minute break here, because this sounds like a good place to have a break. And again, if the story ended here, I think we'd be all very happy and could go on our way, but it doesn't. So that's why you have to come back. Yeah, you have to come back after your break. Yeah, thanks. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started again. Please take your seats. Yes, I did. Sit down, everybody, please. Yeah, what is it? That's the problem is, come on back, everybody. Okay, we'll start calling out names if we need to. Sue Klumpenhauer. Marie Hasegawa. Tanya Kamori. Please take your seat. Boarding will be closing very shortly, and your flight will not be available to you. Thank you. William asked me just to remind people that we do have the presentation actually being both live streamed and recorded right now, if you ever want to go. And I can make a copy of the slides available to anybody who wants them. So, if you feel like you would like to go and review all of this very wonderful stuff, by all means. Yes, and so there will be tests. And if you want to come back to the next session, you'll be required to pass the test for this one. Or maybe you won't want to pass. Oh, yeah, the certificate. Yeah, very good idea. I should give a little bit as well. If you get a very good mark, we'll put a little star on your test. Yeah, a little happy face. Yeah, so where are we? 1 hour down, 5 to go. That wasn't so bad, was it? Okay, well, anyhow. So we're at this place now in kind of an overall Western, call it Western philosophy, Western Christian thought, where things are sort of coming together, at least from a thought perspective. Classical Christianity basically pervades most of Western civilization, which would be, again, Europe primarily. And so we're at this good place, but as usual, things are not always as good as they seem, and they're not always as good for as long as you would like them to be. And a couple major events occurred, but one of the biggest event of the 14th century was, in fact, the Black Death, bubonic plague. And it was the most devastating plague in history, that at least that we know of. 50% of Europe's population died. 50 million people died. That's a lot of people. And we think about COVID and what that's like, and there was a worldwide death toll, I think somewhere in the 2 to 3 million, something like that. Anyhow, clearly, and the mortality rate of the bubonic plague was 80%, at least that's what it was estimated as. So if you contracted it, there was an 80% chance that you would die, and so many, many people died in Europe at the time. There were a lot of things that happened as a result of that, of the Black Death. One of them being a questioning of religion. Again, why is this happening? Where is God? The church did not have the answers. In fact, the church itself weakened, not only because they started to lack funds because parishioners couldn't give any funds anymore, but because half the clergy died, half the leadership in the church, whether it be monks, whether it be trained teachers, whether it be bishops, or even upper echelon clergy. it touched everybody. Half of them died. As well, huge social upheaval. In some ways, perhaps it's good. Feudalism, for instance, which was the economic system by where one person, a lord, owned a whole bunch of territory, and within his fief, or fiefdom, peasants were allowed to farm. Some of them were just slaves. Some of them were allowed to farm and take a share of the crops from those farms, but overall it was owned by the feudal lord. Well, that pretty much ended, and it ended because half the feudal lords died. And when they died, there was no lord to operate the fiefdom anymore, and so the individual landowners would take over. I own this land now. This is mine. And as a result of that, in fact, there was this idea that, there was class distinctions between lords and serfs and peasants and all those sorts of things, and that kind of got eliminated, as in there was none of that anymore. If you could take the land, you could own the land, you could work the land, and you could make your own money and do your own sort of thing. They became entrepreneurs, if you will. So, in a way, I suppose, something good came from that. However, the church itself weakened. One other thing that happened, though, that was also interesting, and again, kind of a tragedy that happened here, was Constantinople actually got sacked for good. And this time, it was by the Muslims. Sultan Mehmed, 1453, came in, took over Constantinople completely, and to this day, it's still a Muslim city. It's now Istanbul. What happened as a result of that, though, was there's all these Greek scholars who were living in Constantinople. Many of them have recreated some of the works that had been lost in the previous sack of Constantinople. All of those Greek scholars took all of their works and they fled to Italy. And with that new influx of Greek scholarship, a huge revival of classical works and knowledge started in Italy. As well, there's the invention of the printing press, the rise of the Italian merchant states themselves. So, for instance, Florence and Venice and these port cities, many of them became very wealthy just through trade. The Medicis in Florence were in a particularly influential one. They started sponsoring scientists, artists, those sorts of folks to do works for them, to do research for them, to paint for them, and those sorts of things. And this whole thing, this whole sponsored, I guess you could say, revival of arts and science, basically spawned the Renaissance. And Plato and Aristotle were part of that too. Their works were also moved completely over to Italy. This Renaissance gave birth to something called humanism. It wasn't called humanism then, but shortly thereafter it became known as humanism. And this idea is that basically humanity, through our study of classics and through science and the world around us and those sorts of things, humanity has the ability and the obligation to understand and shape the world. And that's really what humanism is. Some tenets of humanism, some important tenets are the importance of education and studying the classics, the preeminence of science and logic and rationality in discovering truth. One other thing that came as a result of that, like I say, is this idea that the church becomes less important. The church, back in medieval times, early medieval times, the church was the source of all truth, everything. The source was the truth. The church was the source of education. The church was the source of basically the economy in many cases. Now, as a result of all of these developments, the church becomes less important. It becomes more of a place where you would go for spiritual matters or for theological matters, but other endeavors, those are all now sponsored privately outside of the church. And so we see this renaissance that occurs. And it's kind of, in some ways, sort of leaving the church behind. Arts, utility of industry and technology. Now, I have a painting up here just to kind of show something. I wasn't sure where to put it, but I put it up here anyhow. And this harkens back to that picture that I showed of Plato and Aristotle walking together. Well, you can't really see it well, but in the middle of that picture is actually the Plato and Aristotle walking together. That's the middle of that picture. All the other figures around them, that's not part of the picture, but it is really part of the overall painting. And that painting is a painting called School of Athens, painting by Raphael. And School of Athens was commissioned by the Pope at the time, and they put up this painting. It's actually in the Vatican right now, and it's not one of the part of the Sistine Chapel part of the museum, but it's in another wing. And so again, a work of art that's part of Christianity, but I think it does point to this idea that even the Christian church at that time recognized the importance of Greece, of Greek scholars, Plato and Aristotle, to the Christian faith. So I just put that up there. But yeah, School of Athens. Anyhow, so now we're into humanism, though. Humanism and education. So up until the Middle Ages, schools and education were basically part of the church, and you had your basic courses of Latin and basic math and scripture. That was your core. But now we've introduced Greek and Roman and Arabic texts into the curriculum, and as well, the establishment of universities. Again, some of these were through the church, but many of them are now outside of the church altogether. And the studies include classical Greek and math and logic and medicine and science. Humanism's basic premise is that the human condition can be improved through learning and education, and that's part of it. Humanism in the arts, the Renaissance, we talked about that. The visual arts, all of the Renaissance artists, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And the upper class is sponsoring all of that work. Music, huge developments in the area of music. Previously, music was basically one tune played on one instrument. This idea of harmony, the idea of polyphonic scales and polyphonic tunes, musical instruments playing all of these different tunes together. That was a huge development. Again, part of the Renaissance. Science started to advance here, and basically what it was is you take Thomas Aquinas and you take his method and you ramp it up a notch by applying all of these various efforts sponsored from all of these wealthy people to go and do these studies. And so we had huge advancements in science. The Copernican revolution, the Earth is not the center of the universe. Astronomy, discovering planets and stars and the planet's motion and those sorts of things. Mathematics, algebra, and calculus. By the way, a little factoid, anybody know where algebra comes from? Any ideas? Babylon? Well, not bad, actually. Algebra comes from the Muslims. It does. It comes from the Arab world. And you can kind of tell from the name, al-jabra. Al-jabr means to bring together. It means that you combine things together, and that's where algebra comes from. Algebra was actually part of the curriculum back in Muslim schools around in somewhere between 800 and 1000 AD. Western civilization discovered it with the fall of Constantinople. We brought all of these Greek scholars, and they had some Arabic works with them, and sure enough, there's algebra in there. So you can blame the Muslims for your PTSD with your math class in high school. Anyhow, calculus as well. Physics, And we'll talk about Newton very shortly because he's a key figure, and biology. All of these huge advances, again, made during this period. And then what about the church? Well, we talked a little bit about it already. The bubonic plague had a huge impact on the church and its influence. As well, continuing religious conflicts. Again, I think most of you know about the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, where the Protestants, and we're part of that tradition, basically protested the corrupt practices within the Roman Church, and as a result split from the Roman Church. And these reformers, as they were called, are basically our church fathers in a way in our Protestant evangelical churches today. But there was a lot of conflict that went along with that church split. There was a war, the 30 Years' War, and it was started by Ferdinand II over Protestants in Germany, which he wanted to get rid of. And after 30 years of basically other countries joining in, supporting or not supporting one side versus the other, it was brutal. It was a brutal bloodshed. And once again, 40% of Europe's population died in this conflict. One even wonders how Europe survived with all these conflicts and diseases. But, and then religion versus science. Famous example of that is Galileo, of course, but there are others. But this idea that science came up with a concept, the church didn't like it, and the church then persecuted the person who came up with that idea. Now, if you really want to know about Galileo, I would urge you to do a little research into that, and you'll come up with probably a more learned opinion about it. The fact is, it had a lot more to do with politics and ego than it did about science versus religion. But the fact is, it was perceived in the public as, this bad religion is now trying to tell us what's right and what's wrong, again, with respect to scientific fact. And all of that weakened the church's position in popular opinion. But yeah, science versus religion was kind of the next battleground as a result of that. The question was, who owns the truth? Who really knows what's true? Is it science or is it the church? With science, the scientific method has its approach to determining truth. Observation, hypothesis, testing, and eventually you come to the truth. And that was kind of not what the church preached for many, many years. So for some people in the public, the church and God was now, along with science, a complementary source of truth. And we would call that Christian humanism. And actually, I believe many of us are probably today within that tradition. We believe that science is a source of truth. And God is also, and the church is also a source of truth. But for others, God was now a fabrication, an unnecessary hypothesis. Science alone is a source of truth. And that was secular humanism. So that was a key, I guess you could call, turning point in Western philosophy. Let's go into a couple of the proponents of each of these positions. Sir Isaac Newton versus Voltaire. I'll start with Sir Isaac Newton. I'm obviously, because I'm an engineer and a Christian, I'm kind of biased towards this guy. He is the father of modern science. He was the founder of modern mathematics, calculus, algebra, plane geometry. He's the founder of classical physics and the laws of nature. His laws of gravitation, his universal laws of motion, they're still used today in every school, in every engineering class, and every physics class. He somehow managed to discover all of these and combine them into one huge compendium of work, the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. Anyhow, that was his big, huge tome that basically became the framework for all of physics and astronomy and engineering, even till today. His foundational assumption was that there was an orderly creator, made an orderly creation with orderly laws that can now be discovered by humans, just like Thomas Aquinas said. On his epitaph, or his tombstone, it said, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in the night, and God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." So that's on his tombstone. And the idea being that, you know what, God's laws were there. They have always been there. It took a great man like Newton to come and just discover them and write them down. And that was his foundational assumption. Much of what he discovered, much of science and the building that it did on Newton's work is now called the Enlightenment. And basically, you could say Sir Isaac Newton extended this complementary partnership between science and Christianity that still exists today for most of us, I would say. We believe that science is very good at producing observations and facts about physical reality. Christianity is the source for observations and truth about the non-physical reality and morality, things like that. And that's that complementary partnership that we hold today.